I founded Vork last year around November with my co-founder Peter. We met through the Y Combinator platform, so they have like this co-founder matching tool that we met through, and we instantly. I'd gone through a few founders that I hadn't actually connected with, and then Peter was the first person out of I think 8 people that I finally met. It's kind of like the Tinder for co-founders.
Mhm.
And then we met in a coffee shop. We were talking about productivity. I had done startups before, so my
Mhm.
entrepreneurship journey actually started off in my second year of university. I did a company called Serval with a friend. We basically built
Mhm.
a hairstyle on demand hairstyling platform for international
Mhm.
students, especially people coming from Africa, Asia, who who needed special hairstyling services. So we just kind of built that online over in Kitchener. It blew up in Kitchener for a bit, and then we sold it off. And then after that, I joined this company called Pulse. We were building IoT technology there, so I was the first salesperson there. Basically, built the sales department there from scratch. Got them all the customers, most of the customers they have today, and then growing. And then last year, kind of jumped ship to Vork after meeting Peter because we kind of connected over productivity and we'd both faced burnout. Peter's a software developer, he's an
Mhm.
engineering manager, he's sort of done a bunch of roles, worked at Ubisoft, Yelp, etc. And he's very friendly. He's very friendly with the concept of burnout, just with the
Mhm.
work he's done. And then same with me, working at a startup, burnt out quite a few times. So we just connected over that. We decided we want to build something for that.
And obviously, you had some kind of startup experience in the past. You've done it before. What what made it different kind of doing it another time, or like the second time, or I mean, depending on how many startups you had in the past, like multiple times, does the process get easier? Is it harder now that you know the amount of work required? Kind of what was the different approach, or was the very similar approach, kind of approaching it the second or third time from kind of having some success in the past?
I would say a bit of both. It's easier from the perspective of, you've kind of done it, so you have more confidence in yourself. At the first
Hmm.
startup I was doing Servo, I didn't know what I was doing, honestly. I just kind
Hmm.
of put one step in front of the other, got some mentors, they helped me out,
Hmm.
guided me on my way. And again, thankful to them even today for the guidance and the knowledge that I got from them. So it was harder the first time. It gets easier every time you do it, in the sense of the process. So the process of building a startup, the process of customer discovery, you get better at that. You get better at understanding problems. I would say that
Hmm.
process gets easy. Everything else is hard in the sense that every new startup is its own different journey. There are some overlaps, but rarely any that make the journey significantly easier the next
Hmm.
time. Yeah.
That is interesting. I guess yeah. Every problem solution stage is so important, and that's really the make or break for a lot of founding teams and startups. So having some experience doing that and realizing, oh, I have to interview my customers. I have to ask them what they want and not pigeonhole or kind of force them to give me the answer I want to see, which is very common for first time founders. You tend to see it's like they'll come to you saying, "Hey, we've created the solution to this problem. Would you like to try it for free?" And they're like, "Well, I guess." And they're like, everyone loves it, but it's pretty much giving like it's like the free beer question when it's
Yeah.
like, "Hey, do you want free money?" Everyone says yes, and you're like, "I'm the genius," and then you realize, oh, no one's going to pay for my solution.
Yeah.
So so burnout is a very common topic. Obviously, more in media, light, I'd say, in recent years, especially with COVID and kind of people not really having that work life separation that is typically needed for that balance. When you realized or when you're approaching that problem, how did it start? Because burnout's everything. There you can go, on the HR side of things, you can look at like ways to minimize tech. How did you figure out where to solve the problem? And kind of how did Vork come to be? Was the idea like, hey, we're in our calendars a lot, let's try to solve this problem? Or was it more the fact that what's the first step for tackling burnout? Kind of how did that go? Because burnout's such a broad topic and there's so many different ways to approach it.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a good question. So we've been through a couple iterations
Mhm.
by the time we are where we are right now. When we first started out, Peter and I bonded on the topic of burnout and increasing
Mhm.
productivity, but it wasn't necessarily burnout that was burnout wasn't what we were trying to solve. It was actually the opposite way. We were saying, how do we build something that increases productivity within an organization,
Mm,
right? So we approach the problem from that perspective, and then when we started looking at what we do is, so there's this problem methodology that I follow, that I learned from Problem Labs at Waterloo. It's basically breaking
mhm,
down a problem to its first principles and then kind of going from there. So
mhm,
what we did is we said, okay, looking at it, we knew that we wanted to solve productivity for tech employees. So we said, okay, what's the biggest sort of time crunch and what's the biggest inefficiency within a tech employee's day, be it a salesperson, well, not
mhm,
necessarily a salesperson, but rather someone, an engineer. um, it was meetings. The meetings was the biggest sort of. So we did our research and we realized 50% of meetings were considered inefficient. That's huge, right? That's like if you're doing 5 meetings in a week or 15 meetings in a week, 7 out of those were inefficient. That's a lot of time wasted. So we started
mhm,
solving the problem from that. We built this app that uh, we built this app that actually looked at your Google Calendar meetings and then rated
mhm,
if they were efficient or not. And then we built some tooling to put in an agenda,
mhm,
other different things that we put in to help sort of solve meetings. While we were building that, we realized pretty quickly that, or at least the way we were building it, the way we were approaching the problem, we realized after talking to Y Combinator, we had an interview with them. They do this 10-minute interview before giving you 500K. We didn't get through that time, and the reason
mhm,
was that we were trying to tackle the problem in a too much of a granular fashion. So,
mhm,
you know, they asked us, okay, what are you trying to solve really? It was like, okay, we're trying to solve burnout and increase productivity. And then they're like, okay, meetings is one thing. Burnout has bigger cultural issues that need to be solved. And we realized that that app that we were building wasn't really what was sort of the core or the core of what we wanted to solve within an organization.
mhm,
So we kind of moved on from there. So we started with increasing productivity meetings, and then we started talking to more C-level execs. I think we talked to like 200 of them, 200 plus,
mhm,
quite a few meetings. I remember having back-to-back meetings and stuff.
mhm,
Um, those guys, and then we kind of went back to those notes we took within those meetings,
mhm,
and then we said, okay, what other problems did people talk about that caused loss of productivity? And everyone
mhm,
just went, okay, they're golden handcuffs, meaning that I'm not that motivated to do my job, so I just kind of get burnt out really easily because I'm not that happy there. And there's quite a few different reasons. So we started looking at that, and we said, okay, how do we solve burnout from a cultural standpoint? And
yeah.
the biggest problems we saw was managers blaming individuals for their burnout, or
Mm,
implying some of that. Going
mhm,
something like, "Oh, this person maybe wasn't doing this right. That's why he got burned out." And then after doing some more research, we talked to a few some behavioral
mhm,
psychologists as well, and one of the biggest things we got was that burnout is a cultural problem. It's not an individual problem,
mm,
and it's always been framed as an individual problem within companies. Some companies say it loudly, some companies say it subtly, but it's always blamed on the individual. So we said, how do we create something that solves a cultural problem, and that's where we are, and that's where we
mhm,
kind of went and said, okay, like you said, burnout comes from the HR standpoint. Burnout comes from there's quite a few facets to it.
mhm,
So we said, how do we? What are the what are the dynamics within just an engineering team, or within any team
mhm,
that we can solve for? So, for example, our app has this burnout analyzer that looks at a
mhm,
person's day, both meetings and tasks, and work time availability,
mhm,
and says, okay, and also assesses their
mhm,
sort of working style. Do they like meetings or do they like doing
yeah.
tasks more? And then kind of analyzes that. So we've kind of made it from like a team perspective, or how can a team function with work?
Hmm. I think it makes a lot of sense, especially on the fact you're touching on. It's more of a cultural thing. A lot of times, I mean, even me working on within the mental health space a little bit in my day job, but it's a lot more time like the system or the ecosystem around you play such a big role into it. And obviously, there is some individual approaches you can do to better your mental state, better your health, or things you can do. But at the same time, the system you're in, especially the corporation, the corporate wellness program, how the company's treating you, or developing programs within the organization play such a big role in the impact or productivity of their employees. One thing we were speaking, especially on the fact that, everyone's a little bit individualistic with kind of looking at their calendar through your tool. One thing that came to mind is how do you know, we always like to say there's so many meetings, oh, everyone has too many meetings. How are you able to kind of approach it saying like, hey, what's too many versus what's not enough? Because I guess you don't really need meetings, but
Yeah.
how are you able to kind of find that line of like, hey, no, these are not as effective number of meetings versus someone who might just be more meeting heavy? How are you able to differentiate that? Because that could be quite a large scale, especially now with work from home. There's being more meetings than is typical.
Yeah, for sure. So there's two things really. One thing is, it's driven by user input in the beginning, in the sense
Mhm,
that we ask the person directly, do you prefer meetings or do you prefer tasks? And then our algorithm
mhm,
basically adjusts their meeting capacity based on that.
mhm,
And then the other thing is the quality of the meeting itself. Does the meeting have an agenda? How many participants are there in a meeting? Can the Vork user, if they in back to back meetings, for example, if for example, this is Monday and I'm looking at my Thursday and I have five back to back meetings and I get another request from someone for another meeting. Vork will
mhm,
go, okay, if you accept this meeting, you're definitely going to burn out on that day, so maybe don't. Maybe suggest
mhm.
another time. So there's like quick actions for that.
Oh,
Now,
interesting.
obviously, like, there is a lot of context that goes into meetings, in the sense that
Mhm,
for me, a meeting could be important, for someone else that meeting couldn't. But that
mhm,
depends on the relevance, and certain factors we can account for. But there are certain factors like meeting quality,
mhm,
the stuff that someone actually puts into a meeting, that we can, and we kind of base it off of that. So it's a combination of, say, user input and
mhm.
what data we can get about the meeting from within the calendar.
That is interesting how you touched on the fact that back to back being one of the largest causing issues or stressors, especially for the fact this reminds me of like even working out. If anyone's ever into fitness, it's like you do legs, you don't go for a run after. But
Yeah,
if you separate them by day, it's not a problem. But it's like just the back to back, the inability to reconnect or recover is such a big thing. And even in my corporation, it's a big thing where it's like scheduling, and I saw even on your application, like scheduling that, like, hey, 50 minutes, do not book time. I need my lunch. I book lunch every day. And at first, people thought that was silly. Like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, why are you booking your lunch? Everyone knows it's lunch. But then, oh, Bob over an account, hey, just quick 5 minutes here, quick 5 minutes there. And then you end up eating at 4 o'clock your lunch. So it's an
exactly. Yeah. I
interesting
mean, we
approach.
kind of
Mhm,
envisioned work as that. So I've my roommate Mohammed. He
mhm,
back in Toronto. I
mhm,
remember one day he walked into my room and it was 8 p.m. and he went, "Hey, you've been working till 8 p.m. for the last month, or I've noticed you haven't hung out with friends. What are you doing? So it was that all I really needed was that external person coming in and telling me, "Hey, man, what are you doing? You need to take a break." And if he hadn't, I was on my pathway to burnout. If he hadn't
mhm,
done that, I could have been burnt out easily for
mhm,
if I hadn't actually. So what I did is I'm like, okay, 5 p.m. I'm going to take a break. So I implemented
mhm,
some rules to stop my burnout from happening. So that's what we want Vork to be. We want Vork to be that friend that goes,
mhm,
"Hey, man, I know you're a high achiever. I know you want to do this, but this is the consequence of you
mhm,
doing this additional hour of work, or you've had off hour meetings for the last week. What are you doing? Maybe you shouldn't do that. Maybe take some time off. Maybe for this one week, don't do
mhm,
off hour meetings. Take a break. Say no." We want work
mhm.
to be that.
The friend and community part is so important. I think that's one thing. It's hard to always see yourself while burning out, but like like everything in hindsight, it's obvious. You're like, well, obviously, I was working too many hours. Lack of sleep is a big thing, especially for long term productivity. But having that like tool or having something that really bird's eye view, looking at something at a glance, see, hey, overall, what's happening here, and personal feel as well. And I think one thing we're seeing more and more, especially within more of the corporate world, funny enough, they're moving away from that grind set mentality more to the realization that hey, starting a business is hard. It couldn't take 10 years. You need your sleep, you need to be healthy, because trying to work while you're not healthy is so difficult, and your productivity is so much to learn. We see a lot of now more entrepreneurial speakers or even like start founders on the Instagrams, the TikTok, the influencers speaking about that. Like, hey, how do I incorporate fitness into my, 8-figure business plan? They're still trying to sell you courses, don't get me wrong, but it's now the more of a shift that, oh, hey, you can't be working, 18 hours a day, every single day for multiple years. Some weeks are rough. That is true. But the idea is that, hey, how can you have extended productivity? It's about the results, not the inputs to some extent. So
Yeah.
obviously, burnout is more pop. Do you think now that burnout's being more popularly spoken about, is this a more of a current problem, or do you think now just more public? Because obviously now with the digital age, we're more ever connected. Do you think, have you seen this over the past few years becoming more of an issue, or is it now just being more light brought onto it? In your opinion?
I think burnout's always been an issue. I would say like burnout is the side effect of humanity going agrarian. Like since agrarian society was a thing, burnout's been an issue. Now I haven't talked to any early farmers about the issue, but I think now it's the pandemic just kind of made it more prevalent in the sense that more people started talking about it once they were stuck. Um, I think in the past, I would say like even back in the 1950s, burnout was always a problem, but people just kind of there was this mentality of corporate grinding, right? Like
Hmm.
oh, I gotta grind away. Like if I'm not grinding away, I'm that still exists by the way in the big four. Like
Hmm.
I have a friend who works in Deloitte, and man, he works 8 a.m.
Hmm.
to 10 p.m. Like if I want to have a meeting with him or do anything, he's just always working. And I mean, and it's just a culture over there, right? Like it's driven by the culture over there. It's not something even I don't think he would have done it if it wasn't for the culture. And now he's talking
Hmm.
about leaving, but it's the damage is kind of done. He's already wasted away
Hmm.
2 years or 3 years that that he's been there. So, anyways, getting back on topic to this one,
Hmm.
it's always been a problem.
Hmm.
Right now, people have the I would say authority, or rather not authority, rather people have the openness on the internet to talk about it and actually do something about it. Because back in the day, like if I would say even in the 1950s, if someone started talking about burnout, he would get fired. Worker rights
Hmm.
weren't there. People were normally working 12-hour days. That was
Hmm.
normal. The 8-hour workday was something that people fought for. There was a whole, I would say, like work revolution, like where the laborers went like, hey, we need 8 hours. You can't make us work 12 hours. You can't make us work 6 days a week. So the 5 days a week, eight
Hmm.
hours a day was something people fought for. And I think now is the right time for a solution that helps with burnout, because now it's accepted, finally accepted,
Hmm.
that burnout is a problem and that it needs to be solved. So I think you're right in the sense that it's always been a problem. Now is when people can actually do something about it, and it's finally acceptable to do something about it. So right now, if you go like, hey, I'm burnt out, I need help, your manager's not going to fire you for it.
Hmm.
You're going to get the help you need. And I mean, commenting a little bit about the wellness programs that you mentioned, I think they help, but I think they're like that. I heard a friend going, my boss brought me, made us work for 2 weeks, and then he got pizza. Pizza doesn't solve
Hmm.
anything. Like like managers will think, oh, we gave some pizza and now everything's okay. No, the mental health, the mental wellness of your employees from working all these hours in those last month or 2 months was still affected. Pizza is not going to solve that.
Hmm.
And I think certain corporate wellness programs, I'm not saying they don't help, I'm just saying they're like
Hmm.
that pizza that
Hmm.
companies provide to sort of cover up the cultural issues that's making their
Hmm.
employees work this much and this hard. Um, so with Vork, we're trying to basically, you know, create more preventative measures rather
Hmm.
than, wellness programs. Great, have that, but here's something that'll actually change your culture so that people don't burn out or don't end up on that edge of the cliff
Hmm.
scenario of burnout. Um, there, yeah.
I I think prevention, like you said, is such an important factor. It's before it was very hard to track. How do you track prevention? I mean, you read I read quite a few books within either the medical field or the AI fields, and the whole idea is that how can being in Canada, healthcare system's such a big part of it. But it's like, how can the healthcare system invest more in prevention? The problem with prevention, though, is that it's hard to attribute dollars to. If you didn't get sick, we don't know for sure it's because X, Y, and Z. On a system level, like you were saying, huge impacts, easy to track. But on an individual level, very difficult to say, like, hey, by not doing X, Y, and Z, I was able to not get sick or not get burnt out. It's very difficult. But I think what you touch on the fact that, hey, by making more of a cultural thing, or especially on a system wide level, it can make greater changes. And then you're able to see, like, hey, maybe we don't need those, like the pizza parties or the, although pizza's great, but we don't need that, what's called like the remedy to the illness. We're solving the illness right at the source. We're fixing the problem and not really trying to fix the symptoms, which is a common thing, especially within a lot of corporate culture things, or especially within even medicine in general. Like,
Yeah,
you
yeah, exactly.
fix
And I
medicine
think
is
you,
so cold.
yeah,
Mhm,
yeah, exactly. And I think you touched on something important there. You can't change what you can't measure. And so far, I would say, so when we were interviewing a lot of managers, when we just directly asked them, like, how many burnt out employees do you have? Oh, I don't think I have that many burnt out employees. Or that was one answer. Or the other answer would be, I think I had a few, but then I gave them a few days off and it got solved. You know,
mhm,
now I don't think any manager wants their employees to burn out.
mhm,
Obviously, like if you're a good manager, you don't want your employees to be negatively affected. However, the other answer we got from managers was, hey, I know my employees are burning out, but I don't know how to go to upper management and say, this is our world is driven by money. It's an
mhm,
unfortunate thing, but it's driven by money. So they went, how do I don't know how to actually quantify this in front of in front of upper
mhm,
management. How do I go to upper management and say that because you're making us do all this, your employees are burning out and quiet quitting or leaving or whatever, whatever. How do I
mhm,
quantify this? So that's another thing we want to really tackle with Vork, and that's why we created the sort of burnout energy bars. The idea
mhm,
is that we give a certain happiness score and a burnout score to individuals, so that you're finally quantifying that, and then kind of a manager can go to their upper management and say that, hey, my team has been burnt out for the last
mhm,
5 months or for the last 6 months. We cannot take this extra project. And another thing we're implementing in the app is uh, cost of meetings. Each meeting that is done has a certain cost effect to it. Everyone knows it, but it's not been visualized. It's not been put in front of people,
mhm,
and that's something we're doing as well. If you're a meeting organizer, organize a meeting with Vork, based on how many people you're putting into that meeting, it'll basically show you how much that meeting is costing you as an organization,
mhm.
or costing your organization, essentially. It's a lot about, I think it's a lot about showing people what the issues are, because sometimes once you put it in front of people, that's where once awareness is always the first step, right?
Mhm.
And that's what we want to do with Vork. Make people aware that there's a problem and give them the solutions
Mhm.
to solve it.
I think we touch on, especially with, if you can't measure it, you can't solve it, or you put it more eloquently. But the idea behind, you need to have, even if it's not finite number, you have to see the impact. And like you said, being able to, within your meeting, see the cost of the meeting. Say, hey, bring all these hours together, and 100 people, maybe 100 is too big for me, but let's say 10 people's time for 1 hour. That's like a whole day of employees productivity, and kind of breaking that down, seeing like, hey, do we need this? Is it worth it? Or is the classic, is an email suffice? Can we do this in an email? I've worked in enough startups where I rode the cultural waves, where it was, hey, don't have a meeting, send an email. Then it was, hey, don't send an email. You sit beside the person,
Yeah,
talk to them. Like, why? There's too many emails. And then now it's the opposite. Now it's like, hey, start sending me emails. Don't keep doing meetings. So it's like always a cycle to try to find that balance,
yeah,
like a boat rocking in the ocean a little bit. But like you said, if you can quantify it, it's a lot easier to say, hey, we know now. It's not that you might not have to do any dramatic changes, but it's like, hey, we're just aware of the cost we're putting in here. And that, even like you saw on the team side of things, giving managers the ability to say, hey, our team looks to be at capacity. You're not seeing we're seeing a decrease in productivity. And sure, this may not be that big of a deal to add a little bit more on, but eventually, like you said, there's a falling off point. There is a point where you have employees quitting to find better opportunities that have better balance, or at least have better intrinsic value. They feel they're getting more out of it. And then once you get to that point, pizza doesn't solve it. People are already looking for new jobs. They're already looking for new things. They're not, like the quiet quitting thing, I think has the wrong connotation. People don't really understand what it is. The idea that you're just working for your paycheck, like, hey,
Yeah.
9 to 5, at 5, I'm off. Sure, that seems normal, but to some extent for productivity, if your employees are happy, not so much that you want them to work 24 hours, but they're willing to maybe take a few hours here, a few hours there to help get work done. But if you're burnt out, you don't care. You're like, hey, it's my paycheck and I'm out. And that's what the quiet quitting thing became so popular. And really isn't that bad. It's more working for your paycheck, which sounds way more nice to say. But
Yeah.
then quiet quitting just has that like BuzzFeedy word or like that clickbaitiness to it.
Yeah, exactly. And I
Now,
think a lot
mhm,
of these things are normalized in the workplace, right? Like it's normal to take calls after hours in a certain organization where it's, you
mhm,
know, a lot of people, and I think it's also a product of someone not consciously putting a barriers, um, and going, okay, 5 p.m. I'm done. So if one person doesn't do it, the second person doesn't do it, the third person doesn't do it, and that's how a culture is created.
yeah, and I think it's one of those things, like you said, once you fix it on the cultural level and see it, it's a lot easier than for individuals to kind of be able to balance their schedule and kind of balance things to ensure that they're more productive. And productivity, I think, is always sounds like me coming from more of a corporate side of things. Like sounds like oh, the organization trying to steal your hours or trying to make you the best worker. But if you're happy, it helps the company for sure. Helps their bottom line, but also helps you to be happy and enjoy your job. Like it's a win-win. It doesn't
Yeah.
hurt people that you're a happier employee,
Yeah,
which is always
exactly. And I
funny when
think
people are.
organizations
Mhm,
are finally understanding that there is a benefit to happier
mhm,
employees. Because happier employees, because there's a lot of research that's been done around, happier employees or keeping employees happy. That's what gave rise to these apps like Headspace, etc. Happier employees means better work quality. It means better culture. It's overall a positive thing. There is really nothing negative, even to a company's bottom line, from happier employees.
mhm. And I think that's so true. Happiness doesn't really hurt anyone; it just makes things better.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is obviously we're speaking a lot about burnout in a corporate level, but you're also a founder of a startup where there's no such thing. I've had a few people on the podcast speak about this. There's no such thing as work life balance. They say you can't have work life balance to be successful. Now, their caveat to this very egregious statement was the fact that you need work life separation. You always have to be working on your company. You can't be, working 9 to 5, then going for a walk in the sense of like taking a hike, going partying, taking the weekends off. You kind of always have to be working on your startup, still getting your sleep and rest and fitness because that's a part of recovery. But it's hard to really have that balance approach. Do you find it hard kind of running a organization around the idea of burnout where you're in an industry being a startup and a founder where burnout is, like you said, almost the norm and expected? Kind of how do you balance the idea of like, hey, am I working hard enough versus, hey, am I really just being burnt out and more hours isn't kind of giving me the result? How are you able to balance that? Because you're kind of in a weird world where you're talking about a big issue while being also in an industry or at least a job that is known for burnout being the norm. How do you balance those approaches?
No, that's fair. So I think I'll start with saying that I always hear founders going, "Oh, I worked 80 hours, or I worked 100
Mhm,
hours." Grind. I don't know, hustle. I mean, maybe in certain organizations or certain startups or certain industries that's needed. Um,
mhm,
for myself, like I do have the work life separation. I've heard different sort of terminologies:
mhm,
work life integration, work life separation. There's like different things. But what it comes down at the end of the day is, were you happy with the work you did? And did you achieve the goals that you set out for yourself? Even in my previous startup, Pulse, we went from two
mhm,
people, Thomas and myself, to 50 employees, and growing right now. um, I had Now, you mentioned expectations of employees to work all these
mhm,
hours at a startup. Now, for a founder to work all those hours, I think that's okay in the sense that it's my company. Whatever hours I put in, I get a lot more benefit than just a salary. I don't
Mhm.
think a founder should expect that from their employees though. Um, when you're, because for that employee, yeah, sure, you gave them equity. I mean, I've heard from people where I've heard from founders, unfortunately, where they said, okay, I gave him some equity. That means that he feels like he's part of the company, which means it'll make him work harder. Yes, it will, but I don't think you should expect that from him, because that
Mhm.
equity that you gave him is like 2%. That's nothing compared to what you have.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're giving him a salary, but you shouldn't expect that. And I think, so personally, I think there definitely should be a different expectation from employees versus what founders have, what they're doing. Now, for myself, I've been able to integrate my work life. Like, even right now in Pakistan, I'm working on this.
Mhm.
With family. I am
Mhm.
also helping my uncle with his factory. Like, we have a chemical
Mhm.
manufacturing factory over here, so I'm starting to help him with that. So I'm kind of balancing all this together here, and it's possible because of the time difference, etc.
Mhm.
Now, the hours that I'm working, again, I wouldn't expect that from someone
Mhm.
working for me, essentially. Um, I've been able to find
And I
my
think
thing. It's
mhm.
just because of doing this again and again and again. And it's also different for different people. Like, for example, my co-founder Peter, he can work insane hours, even compared to what I do. He can work insane hours.
Mhm.
Like, he's messaging me at 5 a.m. in the morning, like, "Oh, I finished this one feature." I'm like,
Mhm.
"Why are you awake at 5 a.m. building this?" You know?
Yeah. I think what you touched on is an important thing as well, is that obviously hours matter, but it's the quality of work is so important. So a lot of founders I spoke to who do work, the hours you work is so difficult because they're like, well, when I'm sitting at dinner table with a napkin thinking of ideas, is that working or is that not working? It's like hard to quantify. So they always say, like, I'm always thinking about the business.
Yeah,
But I think the big difference for, like
I
you
think
said, for
as long
founders is that.
it's the
Mhm.
zone, right? Like, as long as you're in the zone. Like, for me, and I had to actually work on this and build this mentality for myself.
Mhm.
I used to be I used to have this problem, and I still do to a certain extent, of taking on too
Mhm.
much. Like, in university, I was doing my startup Serville, I was doing 5 courses, I was
Mhm.
working to just pay bills and stuff. Obviously, my startup
Mhm.
at the time wasn't making me that much money. So I was working, I was social life, like, it was,
Mhm.
and I took on like two clubs. I was leading a club, and I was
Mhm.
part of a few, just in different roles, and it was too much. I wasn't able to get good marks. And it was a lesson, I think, for me. Um, what I realized was, working isn't necessarily about. So if I say I'm working 50 hours a week, it's not
Mhm.
about, oh, I'm continuously typing for 50 hours.
Mhm.
As long as you're in the zone and you're thinking about work, you're working. So
Yeah.
you have to train, and I had to train my mind to sort of shut down. And a trick I've used is just literally just saying shut down to myself. And I'll just go like,
Mhm.
okay, Vork, shut down. It's just a mental trick that you make for
Yeah.
yourself, and it kind of shuts that down, and then I'm in the zone for
Mhm.
not working, essentially.
I remember someone I talked to, when a few founders, and one thing I came up with was the idea that one of the biggest skills you can learn for productivity or burnout is how to relax aggressively. Like, how can you completely disconnect for like 1 hour, no phone, no nothing, clear your mind, go stare at a tree. I like bonsai and gardening, so I always say, like, I'm gonna go stare at a tree for an hour. And it works. But the heart, like you said, it's very hard to disconnect. And then when you're like, oh, I'm relaxing, but I'm still thinking of my business, you're not relaxed then. You're always like it's like if playing video games, it's like you're like, instead of running and using stamina, you're like, okay, I'm walking, but I'm still like toggling it a little bit. So you're like, you're never fully recovered, and recovery is such a big part of it. So I think how you touched on the fact that, like, being building that separation, being able to think through your tasks and know what you're capable of and how what works best for you. You're an individual. What works best for you is so important, especially for achieving those outcomes.
Yeah,
So obviously now, burnout's growing, your business, you and your co-founder kind of developing this business. Kind of, what does the future look like? Like, what's the plan? I know we talked a little more about corporations. Is the idea to work with more corporations, kind of implement this software? I think you'd call it into the
yeah,
organization. Kind of, what does the plan look like in the next few years for you guys?
yeah, for sure. So currently, we built an app that sort of helps individuals, analyze their workday,
Hmm.
etc. Helps them quantify burnout and solve for it. The idea is to expand this to teams. So we just recently launched Teams feature, which is basically it's a simple check-in. What
Mhm.
you do is you at the end of the day, an employee checks in, and then a manager basically gets an aggregate of all their employees' check-in data, and it gives them a score of 3 out of 5 out of happiness.
Mhm.
So that's one simple thing that we're doing. The idea over time is to build in the next few months is to build a inter-team software that basically goes, for example, like if Bob is booking on, I don't know, Adrian's calendar,
Mhm.
no affiliation with anyone, just random names.
Mhm.
If Bob is building on Adrian's calendar, Bob will get a message saying that, hey, on maybe don't book a meeting on Tuesday, because if you do, Adrian's going to burn out. Book it on Wednesday
Mhm.
instead. So it's features like that we're building in. Um, Basically anything that helps teams or coworkers understand or appreciate each other's time a little bit
Mhm.
better, and understand, if they're burning out or not, and then help with that, essentially help change
Mhm.
cultures through that.
Like you said, it's all about having what you can track, having those metrics, and allowing teams to say, "Hey, what is we need a meeting. What's the most effective time to do this? And do we need a meeting?" I think having the team component, like you said, fixing the culture around it is really the biggest, kind of the biggest alpha in the room to fix a lot of these
Yeah,
symptoms of the problem of individual burnout.
yeah, exactly. So like,
So, I
I
mean,
guess
if
part
people, in this,
schedule. Sorry,
mhm,
on.
I'll say
Yeah,
I think it's makes a lot of sense to move on to the team side of things. And if people or individuals kind of want to learn more about this, kind of try out the application or try out the app software, the plugin. What do you define it as? Is it software plugin? I'm too boomer now with my definitions of like SaaS products. I'm back in the day when SaaS was everything. Now there's different terms. So what would you classify it as, and how can people find it if they want to try it out and kind of take a look at it?
for sure. So it's a Chrome extension. You can find it on
Mhm.
the Chrome App Store. Basically, the reason we started off with a Chrome extension is because it plugs in with Google Calendar, and then it analyzes your day on there. Um, it was just easier to build for the G Suite, for the Google
Mhm.
stack. We're going to be building this for Microsoft as well. The idea also going forward is to
Mhm.
be able to integrate with apps like Slack, Zoom,
Mm.
as well as Gmail, and then measure productivity, or rather measure burnout from those applications, as well as other work tools that an organization uses. So that it's not just based on, because it's not just the time of a person that affects their burnout, it's also the tools that they use, it's also the time that they
Mhm.
spend in other applications. So essentially, that's sort of like the roadmap for the future. So currently, you can find it on the Chrome App Store. If you just search Vork, it'll be right there. It's
Mhm.
pretty easy to install. Just add to Chrome, and then it's ready to go on Google Calendar.